Okay, so Unit 5, A Nation Divided. Um, Tensions rise, 1840 to 1860. So in the mid 1800s, immigration boomed. There were millions of people coming to America. Most of them went to New York, mainly Irish and German, and they were met with nativism, xenophobia, which was um, Americans that did not were anti-immigration and they didn't like especially the Catholicism and drinking that the Irish and the German brought with them culturally. The Know Nothing Party was a essentially a nativist political party that was founded on anti-immigration and anti-Catholicism. Um, the name actually comes from at the beginning of it, they kept it secret, and if they were asked about it, they would be like, "I know nothing." So after the Mexican American War, over 500,000 square miles of land was added to the United States. It was so much. And of course, whether or not slavery would be allowed in these new states or new territories was heavily debated. Um, the Compromise of 1850 settled it. It it served as the final blow to the Whigs. Northern Whigs joined new parties, Southern Whigs did too. I'll talk about it more later. Five main bills passed in this compromise. You have California was added, and it was a free state. The remainder of the territory was divided into Utah and New Mexico. Slavery wasn't mentioned, and buying it wasn't decided yet. And buying and selling of slaves was banned in D.C., but not actually slavery itself. Um, Texas paid 10 million for a part of New Mexico, and of course the Fugitive Slave Act. This was passed, yeah, 1850, and it made it so all escaped slaves, even if they got to the north, they weren't safe from being returned to their owners, and it was it was a way Southerners forced their views of slavery onto the North because like they would force Northerners to go out and help look, and it was possible that if they refused to or didn't do a good enough job, they would be punished. Um, Here's some stuff, just ads warning uh, African Americans. Uh, so Northern response to this was the personal liberty laws, which gave captured African Americans the right to trial by jury and no longer required for authorities to recognize claims for fugitives. So, yeah. And then at the same time, Harriet Beecher Stowe was a writer who she came from a rich family and she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a brutal depiction and accurate depiction of slavery, and it really did spread abolitionism in the North like wildfire. It was very effective. The rise of the Republican Party. It started from the Free Soil Party, which its purpose was to prevent the expansion of slavery in the West. And yeah, so the Whigs, um, the as I said earlier, the Northern Whigs, a lot of them joined the Republican Party and um, just increased its numbers. Um, yeah, here it is. Whigs are done, and Northern Whigs joined the Republican Party. Southern Whigs went to the Nativist Party, and then later on to the Democratic Party. Um, Brooks Sumner affair was um, there was this Republican senator, and he insulted another senator, Andrew Butler, and he for his pro-slavery views, and Butler responded. He beat him really badly with his cane, and this was seen as like a violation of free speech, and it was also the North started seeing the South as this violent people that um, is almost barbaric. Bleeding Kansas. So when Kansas was proposed as a state, um, again, whether or not slavery could be expanded was heavily debated, and Stephen A. Douglas um, suggested that um, the issue would be settled through popular sovereignty, which, yeah, instead of following previous compromises that would have prevented that. Um, and the Lecompton Constitution was a pro-slavery constitution proposed by the South for Kansas, and it was pro-slavery. Um, but James Buchanan supported it, but Congress did not allow it. Continue. Yeah. So Kansas-Nebraska Act was the issue of slavery was to be voted on as popular sovereignty, and thousands of people from both sides rushed to Kansas and in order to vote on it, and over 100 people died in the chaos that it brought. There was just so many people. Um, t- Tension was increasing. Um, the North believed in free labor, middle class values. They were Republican mostly, and of course, slavery was backwards. The South, on the other hand, believed that slavery was superior um, economic practice, and that free labor was like degrading to workers. And of course, they were Democrats. Dred Scott decision in 1857. It was people began to question what the status of a slave in a free territory was, and uh, Supreme Court decided that it does not change it. They're not citizens, and it was just they used the Fifth Amendment, the right to private property, to justify that. Um, the Missouri Compromise's bans were seen were talked about as being unconstitutional, and the North started to worry about slavery expanding even more. Lincoln Douglas debates. Abraham Lincoln, in his earlier career, he was a senator in Illinois. He took part in a series of debates with Stephen Douglas, and they were both trying to make their party. He was a Republican, Douglas was a Democrat, and the arguments were mostly about slavery. And uh, he thought it should not expand into new territories. He was scared that slavery would become nationalized, and that he said that the Union would not last as divided on this issue. Um, and then Douglas argued supported popular sovereignty and that on the issue of slavery, and that's the Freeport Doctrine basically. Um, like it should be voted on either way. And a lot of Southern Democrats stopped liking him because they thought it should just always be legal slavery. John Brown's raid. This was John Brown tried to raid. He tried to raid the federal arsenal. He didn't. He failed, and well, okay, so he tried to raid it and start like a slave revolt in Virginia. He failed, but Southerners were like got scared, and he was seen in the North as like a martyr for the abolitionist cause. And here's a painting of him, a quote by him. So, fat year later, election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln wins, He stands against slavery. He wants to construct a Pacific Railroad and make protective tariffs. Southerners are worrying about slavery. They're scared. The Crittenden Compromise is proposed because of this, trying to immortalize like that's nationalizing. Actually, yeah, that's nationalizing slavery by adding an amendment dedicated to it in the Constitution. That did not work. Okay, on to the Civil War. Things are, yeah. So secession begins and the Confederacy starts, and the South at this point thought that their being in the Union was completely voluntary, and if they weren't happy with it, they could leave. And South Carolina was the first to secede, and they saw themselves as doing the same thing that the Patriots had done in the late 1700s. They thought it was the same kind of thing, and they formed the Confederate States of America. Um, and they created the Constitution, which was, of course, pro-slavery, and it had 6 year single-term presidencies. I thought that was kind of interesting. Um, the first strike, Fort Sumter, the South bombards a Union fort in North Carolina. No one dies, but this is like there's no going back. So each North and South form their own strategies. The North starts out with the Anaconda Plan, and this is to blockade the southern coast and invade through the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half. They didn't fully do this, but they did a blockade, and they went up the Mississippi, I think. And then their advantage is they were more industrialized, they had better transportation, they had railroads, they had better weapons because of the factories, and they had bigger armies, and they were more stable. The South, their main strategy was they wanted to get Britain involved by um, refusing to sell cotton to them because the British factories, textile factories, that was their main export. They relied on raw cotton, and they wanted to use that to essentially coerce them into um, to get their support, but that didn't work. Um, and then Southern advantages, they were fighting on their own land. That's a huge advantage. Fighting was lower risk. They knew the land better. Um, Yeah, which is definitely a huge advantage. Northern reactions to war, the draft began, and Irish immigrants in New York did not like this. There were these draft riots, and people were scared of being um, pulled into the military, and they were scared that when they got back, their jobs would be taken by former slaves. And yeah, so freed slaves fled north and joined the Union Army. Copperheads, they were Northern Democrats who were against dividing the Union, but they were like seen as cowards by everyone. Copperhead is like a snake. Like they were not liked. And a lot of them were jailed by Lincoln because he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which because he wanted to preserve morale, which is basically like needing a justified cause to arrest someone, and he just suspended that in order to make sure attitudes about the war remain positive. Some copperheads. Economic reactions. The Pacific Railroad Act, Transcontinental Railroad construction started. Morrill Land Grant Act donated each state land in the West. I saw that it was to build like colleges. I didn't put that in though. National Banking Act, it created a national bank, nationalized the currency. That's the more or less the money that we use today looks like that. and then the Homestead Act. Anyone could apply for free land in the West. Emancipation Proclamation. Abraham Lincoln issued this. It went into effect in 1863. It freed all slaves in rebelling territory, but they were not citizens yet, and they were called freedmen, and they kept that name for a long time, even after they were citizens. Um, the war was explicitly about slavery at this point, and this kept powers out of the poor because they were worried about how they would look if they were supporting slavery, if they were supporting a country that its foundation was on slavery. Um, but it was only in rebelling territories because the Union did not want to risk at all that the border states would secede and join the Confederacy. South had a lot of setbacks during the war. Rising inflation, higher taxes caused food shortages. The draft exempted people with 20 plus slaves, so basically pretty wealthy people. They were a lot less industrialized. They didn't have as many railroads, and the North just had better firepower. So the Battle of Gettysburg was um, the South decided to play the offensive and invade the North. And it was the bloodiest battle of the war. Over 50,000 people died. The North won, and Abraham Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address, and he describes the war's losses as sacrifices made towards this new age of freedom. And this was really when the tide changed in the war. Um, yeah, here's him talking about it. So yeah, tables turn. So after a bunch of switches, Ulysses S. Grant is finally put in charge of the Union Army. He switches the strategy to a war of attrition, just wearing down the South, exhausting them of all their resources and of their military. And then Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman, was a Union general. He was one of the first people to embrace this idea of total war, like really hating the enemy, like completely. And his army just was like a swarm of locusts. Like everywhere they went, they destroyed everything. They ate all the food and they uprooted supply lines. They burned down like a ton of Atlanta. And Sherman promised the land that had been abandoned or seized in his campaign to be given to former slaves. His famous line is 40 acres and a mule. This is Sherman's necktie. They would melt the railroads and they would like wrap it around trees. And that's Atlanta being burned down. And here's a quote about total war from him. End of the line. The South at this point was in shambles. They were worn down. They were done. And Robert E. Lee surrendered to the North on April 9th, 1865. And Abraham Lincoln was assassinated only 5 days later. Andrew Johnson, he was a Democrat, takes over, but Lincoln's 10% plan persists. Southern states will be reaccepted the Union only if slavery was abolished, and they support at least at least 10% of their population supports it. Losses over 600,000 casualties on both sides, and that's just confirmed. It was probably more, and that was at least 2% of the total population in the United States, and it was the deadliest war in America's history. It was only after Vietnam was the people that had died in the Civil War less than the number of Americans that died in all the other wars combined. It was, yeah, a lot of people, a lot of lives were lost. So, on to Reconstruction. Um, the war was over. New amendments, 13th Amendment, forbade slavery except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment gave everyone born in the United States citizenship in the state and in the country, and protection to by the law and rights to their own property. And then the 15th Amendment later on, race does not affect whether or not one can vote. Um, so women's rights activism, it 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 was brought out again because the Civil War kind of took focus from women's rights to civil rights for African Americans. That was just such a focus for a long time, and it was kind of coming back into uh, the picture again. And women and feminists, like women's rights activists, were upset because slavery was abolished and these former slaves were able to vote, but they couldn't. And there was also in the 15th Amendment, it uses the word male, and this was the first time that like uh sex or gender had been like specified in like the rights in the amendments in the Constitution. Freedmen in America. So a lot of former slaves, freed slaves, began cultivating land that had been abandoned during the war. Some had been given to them, and they also took up sharecropping. And it was like usually former slave owners would let them work on their land, but they would take like a crazy share. Like they would take a ton. Like sometimes they even took like 70% of their either profits or their harvest. Um, Places with a black majority, which there was a lot of, and places where a lot of um, the white population had died in the war, a lot of black office holders were elected during Reconstruction because of this. Um, and then the Freedmen's Bureau was formed in 1865, and it helped people displaced by the Civil War. And it actually wasn't just uh, people who were freed. It was also like poor whites who were Southern whites who found themselves found them lost, found themselves lost. They funded schools, black literacy boomed, education was becoming more accessible, um, and it helped African Americans who weren't going to farm find jobs as free laborers. Here's yeah. Initial resistance. Andrew Johnson was did not support racial equality and vetoed attempts at giving land to former slaves. Um, oh, I forgot to delete something there. Yeah, that promise that Sherman made, he prevented that. He rescinded that. And then the South passed black codes, which were laws made to restrict the lives of free blacks as much as possible. And uh, sharecropping continued um, because these people these former slaves had been farming all their lives and they didn't really know where to go. And southern plantation owners continued to take advantage of them even after they had been freed. Um, so, of course, there's going to be my responses that were not shared by the majority. So, carpetbaggers was both of these are like slurs that the North and the South used. So carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved to the South for personal gain. They kind of wanted to fill in the niches, political and economic, that um, wealthy Southern elites had lost during the Civil War. And then scallywags, I don't know, were typically poor white Southerners who supported Reconstruction, and they would often work with blacks, and they would compromise to get their a shared political end. They would work together in politics. And here's one of each. Um, Punishing the South. So the radical Republicans, they were very assertive after having just won the Civil War. They took control of Congress. They had a two-thirds majority. It could overrule presidential vetoes. They didn't even let former Confederates serve in Congress for a time. And they did the Military Reconstruction Act, which was, it made Southerners, create new constitutions that accepted the new amendments, and they split the South into five military districts, and each was overseen by a formal Union general until their constitutions were approved by Congress. So election of 1868, Ulysses S. Grant, he was this American hero. He was the prime candidate, and he won the election. Um, his opponent, Horatio Seymour, he was a white supremacist. He backed the KKK and their violence that like scared people, scared voters. Um, Waving the bloody shirt was like the Southerners used this phrase to ridicule Northerners who would like make emotional references to like Northern soldiers that had died in the war. Um, Grant's first term, he was a great general, but he proved to be lacking and ineffective as president. When he was his presidency, there was a ton of scandals, and like three people were convicted, and then the most famous was probably the Credit Mobilier scandal, and it saw shares of Pacific Railroad construction like being used to pay off, being given to influential politicians to pay them off. Reconstruction started to be associated with corruption, and people were losing interest in it, and even Northerners were losing interest in it. And the liberal Republicans formulated to prevent his reelection. They were unsuccessful, and they were much less interested in Reconstruction and civil rights. Grant was also pretty lenient with the KKK until his second term. The North, well, it was still in his first term actually. Um, the North loses support for civil rights. Um, it just had already been going down, and then the Panic of 1873, it was like a really, really bad depression, and it was caused by the railroad construction, and it took the focus off of African Americans, and it made it just a very low priority at this point. White supremacist groups, so Redeemers were Democratic elite Southerners who were opposed to Reconstruction, opposed to civil rights, and they supported the KKK, which, the Ku Klux Klan, they would violent acts, they would scare voters, they would commit violent acts, they would sometimes even, you know, like kill African Americans, and they were not kept in check by, as I was saying earlier, by Ulysses S. Grant until the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871, and suspended the writ of habeas corpus to combat the KKK and groups that were like it. The end of Reconstruction, Compromise of 1877, it was this informal agreement among Northerners and Southerners. Southerners would allow for Rutherford B. Hayes to become president, but the U.S. withdrew all the troops from the South, and it ended Reconstruction once and for all. African Americans at this point, it had died down. Um, the spirit was lost at this point, and support for civil rights, it was dead at this point. And segregation and legal loopholes took away the rights of African Americans, and several legal cases they just slowly deteriorated, ate away at equality for blacks in America. And so this started with the slaughterhouse cases. It was like the slaughtering company tried to establish a monopoly outside of New Orleans, and the butchers that had already been there argued that it would be violating the 13th Amendment because they would be involuntarily working for that company. But it was deemed constitutional because they could still earn their own living. So keep going. U.S. versus Crookshank. It was after the Colfax massacre, which was when a group of white men killed over 100 black politicians. They burned down a building with over 100 black politicians in it to because of like a some political dispute, and in court it was determined that racial discrimination was okay as long as it wasn't on like a state level, like individuals could treat others poorly if they chose to. And they used the Second Amendment, like the right to bear arms, to like talk about how like in the same way like the government isn't like encouraging you to have guns, but it's not stopping you from having them. Um, and it just justified the poor treatment of African Americans throughout the South. Was used to justify it at least. Here's the justice. Here's aftermath of the Colfax massacre. Um, U.S. versus Reese. It started with a black man. He was refused the right to vote by two people, and they told him like you have if you pay a tax, you can you can vote, and or that's some legal thing. And he did it, and they still refused it. And the court used a loophole in the Enforcement Act's requirements, and they said it was too broad, and they decided it didn't disobey the 14th and 15th Amendments. And this led to African Americans everywhere, like not being able to vote or not being able to vote for who they wanted to vote for. And then the civil rights case in 1883, it was five different cases, and in all of them, blacks were denied um, access to like businesses or privately owned establishments that still were open to the public. Like, and it was not determined unconstitutional because they said that people could prevent whoever they wanted um, from access to their private property, and it was not deemed to go against any of the new amendments. Um, that's all in this unit. Thanks for listening. Um, Sorry for those little errors, but it's fine. All right, thank you.